Welcome everybody to my channel. This is Mon, and in this video I'm gonna go over how to properly build the Power Surge Outsider Socr, so let's get right into it. Now, as per usual tradition, let's take a look at how the weapon functions in order to know how to build it. So, if we take a look at the weapon features, 35% chance to trigger Power Surge when hitting an enemy. Crit hits increase the chance of triggering Power Surge by 30% based on weapons trigger chance. So that's 30% based off of 35%, which essentially means it's an increase of 10.5% for 3 seconds. Now, please don't get baited by this feature. It's not because crit hits increase your chance to proc Power Surge by 10.5% that you should now start building lots of crit rate. But I'll go over this later. And for some reason, for the third feature, instead of making it just inside of the first one, they decided to make a whole feature for it. So if we read it, it's plus 30% chance of triggering Power Surge based on weapons trigger chance, which essentially just means 10.5%. That's just built in the weapon itself. So I don't know why they didn't just straight up say 45% chance to trigger Power Surge when hitting an enemy. But here we are. Now, let's just go take a look at what Power Surge is really quickly. So, deal status damage equal to a 50% PSI intensity once. So, what this means is that you should calibrate up your gear because that's what increases your PSI intensity. And then, you also inflict Power Surge status. So, this is just a status that makes it so that your enemies, well, more like PvP, where people will actually lose minus 40 accuracy on their gun. And then the damages of shock element type. The additional damage cannot crit, cannot strike weak spots, and will not decay with distance. All of this is true for this gun. Then they give a reduced version of the damage formula. If you're interested in knowing more about this, I've already made a video about how, well, the damage formula for Power Surge is calculated. So if you're interested, go check it out. But this is essentially what Power Surge is. So now moving on to your calibration attributes, well, I might also explain the crit rate quotation requirement for this gun here. But before I explain everything, I just want to say that you'd want rapid shot style for your main effect for as much DPS as possible, especially if you play in a PvP setting. So pretty much to deal as much damage as possible with this gun consistently, you'd want to focus largely on elemental / status damage for this gun and have a little bit of crit rate to make the damage as consistent as possible. So from the weapon feature that we just read, from the second feature, crit hits increase the chance of triggering power surge by 30% based on weapon's trigger chance for 3 seconds. We know that we want to land crit hits periodically to increase your chances of proccing, well, this feature. So ideally, you'd have around 10% give or take to 20% give or take crit rate, because that much crit rate will allow you to consistently proc this weapon's feature. So let's just do some math with an example. Let's say, hypothetically, you have 21% crit rate, which only comes from the gun itself, right? So you get 6% here, and you have crit boost. If you have 21% crit rate, that would mean that you crit every 1 divided by 0.21. You would crit every 4.76 bullets. This pretty much means that you're always going to have this buff active even after you reload and shoot again if you have rapid shot style. Now, if we do the same but with 11% crit rate, 1 divided by 0.11, you're going to, well, proc that weapon feature every 9 bullets. This, well, is still good, as 90% of the time after you reload, you still have the buff active for like barely 1 second, which is good enough for you to crit, since with my build, you'll have 670 fire rate, which means that you shoot out, 670 divided by 60, so you shoot out 11 bullets per second. But of course, with that in mind, I can finally move on to, well, the calibration attribute substats and explain it a little bit better. So due to this so-called crit rate requirement, you're actually pretty flexible on your choice. So you could, for instance, choose to get 1 crit roll from the calibration's first substat, and then get elemental damage from the second, then get 2-piece lone wolf, or even not one lone wolf. You can go with elemental on your first sub, but crit on your second, and then call it a day for your crit rate requirement. Or you could instead also go with 2 times elemental damage bonus for your Kelly, but get yourself something like crit boost on your gloves mod, and etc. This can essentially allow you to optimize your build depending on the quality of your different calibration attributes and your mods. So now let's move on to the accessories. So starting with the muzzle, if you don't need stability, you should go with large break for the accuracy. However, if you do need the stability, you should go for the hammer compensator. Then for optic, I'm running the compact reflex sight because, well, it's pretty good and it looks good. However, if you don't have that, you can always run the tactical holographic sight or even the sealed reflex sight. Then for tactics, I am running the tactical laser sight for the most amount of accuracy possible and for the 12% aiming speed. However, if you ADS, you wouldn't really need accuracy, so you could go for even more stability with a compact infrared indicator. Then for the magazine, it's always going to be extended rifle mag that you'll want to run. Now for your secondary weapon, if you're going to make the Outsider your main DPS weapon, then really your supportive options are going to be the Bingo and the Wildfire. Ideally, you don't run the recurve crossbow. Now I do know that it gives you 15% crit rate, but you don't really care about that much crit rate on this gun. So really, your choice is going to be between the Bingo and the Wildfire. Both are great options. Just know that they give different buffs. So for instance, the Bingo, well, to start off, they both give the bullseye effect. And if you, preferably you'd have the vulnerability amplifier mod equipped, which gives you plus 8% vulnerability when you hit enemies. So if we start with the Bingo, it grants you weak spot damage with 15% on hit for 10 seconds, stacks up to 3 times. You don't actually need to hit weak spots to proc this buff. And then after defeating an enemy with a weak spot hit with this weapon, attack plus 15% for 20 seconds. So this is what's cool about this gun. Then for the Wildfire, you can spread the bullseye and weapon damage plus 25% if the bullseye does not spread, as in if there are no enemies within the area. Then when hitting a weak spot of marked enemies, attack plus 3% for 10 seconds, up to 3 stacks. This is absolutely useless. You actually lose this buff. The reason I say this is because, for instance, here, if I just shoot at him, right? If I shoot at the dummy, I have the 3 stacks, I swap weapons, and I lose it. But essentially, those are going to be your 2 options. Then for your melee option, it's going to be the long axe. It gives you the Fortress Warfare buff. And if you do the long animation fully, it also gives you 8% crit rate per enemy hit. So for instance here, if I do a test on the dummy, I do the full animation with a heavy attack, you can see that I get a little buff at the bottom of my screen right here. Light strike, double storm boost, crit rate and melee speed are increased. So it does give you a bit of crit rate, although you wouldn't really care much about it. It's more the fortress warfare that you like, which is going to be, well, super armor and weapon damage plus 20%. Now, of course, the interesting gimmick about the long axe is that you can animation cancel. So pretty much I just do the beginning of the animation and then I instantly swap to another weapon. So like this. And I will get the buff. So these are going to be your secondary and your melee weapons. Now moving on to gear, let's start with the key gear. The key gear will always be Mayfly goggles, power surge trigger count +1, which is what really helps your damage. Now it does, the game does balance it with power surge damage minus 30%, but essentially this is the best one. The other one that you can kind of see would be gas mask hood. Now this is not for this gun, this is for the corrosion shotgun. And if you're curious about how to build the corrosion shotgun guide, I've already made an updated guide on it, so be sure to check it out if you're interested. Now let's move on to the gear piece bonuses. So pretty much go with 3-piece shelter, with 2-piece savior, or 2-piece heavy duty or lone wolf, keeping in mind their star rating. So for instance, my 3-piece shelter with 2-piece heavy duty is actually performing better than my 2-piece savior with 3-piece shelter. So pretty much the reason for that is because my heavy duty is sitting at like 4-star rating, 5-star rating. By the way, if you enjoy my content, don't hesitate to like the video and subscribe to my channel. I greatly appreciate the support. Now, let's move on to the Substats Priority. Just go with talent suffix for all your mods. Look for power surge suffix on weapon and mask, and only on weapon and mask because they're only available for you as weapon mods and mask mods. And if you're wondering whether or not resonance mods can be good, no, they cannot. The reason for that is because it needs to be ramped up, and also the fact that when it is fully ramped up, it gives the exact same bonus as talent when they're both at gold value, and talent doesn't need to ramp up, which is what makes resonance pretty bad for this gun. So if we just take a look at what resonance does here, essentially you always have to fill a condition to get the buff. So here, for instance, if you look at the first line, deal 1 instance of crit damage, elemental damage plus 1%. So here I'd have to deal crit damage, which you're not going to be dealing crit damage often on this gun. So already we can see it's only plus 1% and stacks up to 8 times. So you actually need to shoot 8 times to get the full buff. Then if we take a look at another instance, if I can just find one. Right, so right here on my third line, you can see deal 1 instance of weak spot damage, elemental damage plus 1% if it were to be, yellow. So really just resonance mods aren't that good for this gun. And then for the rest of the subs for your talent mods, look to have stuff like status damage bonus, damage against X type of enemy, magazine capacity, and reload speed boost. Now for your substats for your power surge suffix mods, try to look for shock damage bonus and kind of the same stuff from talent. Just know that power surge suffix mods cannot have crit damage, although they can have power surge crit damage bonus, though you won't really care about that. They also cannot have status damage bonus, weak spot damage bonus, weapon damage bonus, nor elemental damage bonus. Now let's go over the fun part, which are the mods. So let's start with the gun. So static shock will be the best. However, substats can make shock rampage close that gap. So choose whichever that has the better substats. Don't go with surge amplifier right here because it's just a worse static shock that needs to ramp up. It's not a worse static shock that needs to ramp up. It's just a static shock that needs to ramp up, which makes it worse. However, it might still be redeemable with substats depending on if you don't have a good static shock yet you have an insanely good surge amplifier, since just surge amplifier is still stacked pretty quickly on this gun because it's just you only need to stack it 4 times, and 4 bullets for this gun, you shoot that out in less than a second. And lastly, shock diffusion is just it's useless for this gun. Then for your secondary weapon mod, always go with vulnerability amplifier. Gives a bonus of 8% vulnerability to the enemy, which will increase your damage. Then for the long axe mod, the Fortress Warfare mods equipped on it they don't matter at all, because their effect will never come into play unless you have the long axe pulled out, which then if you have the long axe pulled out, you're just losing damage by not shooting with your gun. Then for your helmet, best in slot will be Deviation Expert. It's a 10% fire rate increase and a 20% status damage increase on the entire magazine, which are the two buffs that you would want for this gun. And the options nearest to that would be Momentum Up if you don't have a good Deviation Expert, since Momentum Up, buffs are split for half of the magazine. And, I don't have a copy of it, but Elemental Havoc is also something you can consider. However, it's just a straight up worse version than Deviation Expert, as it doesn't give the 10% fire rate, and to have the 20% elemental damage from Elemental Havoc, you'd need to be sitting at above 90% HP all the time, which also makes it very conditional. Then, for your mask mod, your only choice is Thunderclap, straight up. First of all, you don't have any other good options for this gun, and the second, Thunderclap synergizes with Mayfly Goggles. So if we just read Thunderclap, right? So after triggering Power Surge 20 times, the next hit summons Celestial Thunder, shock damage of 200% PSI intensity. So it's just a small nuke here. Well, not a small nuke. It's 4 times your usual damage. So here, the condition for that is that you need to trigger Power Surge 20 times. However, if you have Mayfly Goggles equipped, pretty much, since for Mayfly Goggles Power Surge trigger count +1, it will decrease the requirement for that by 2 times. So you'll only need to trigger Power Surge 10 times, and then the next one will be the Power Surge Nuke. Now for your gloves, like I've explained it kind of a little bit, for your gloves choice earlier during the calibration attributes, you can pick between Elemental Overload, Status Enhancement, or Crit Boost, whichever that has the better substats. Now, to this day, I still receive comments about people asking me to explain why I recommend status enhancement on guns that apparently do not benefit from status damage bonus. So I'll just clarify this confusion real quick in this guide. Status damage bonus will boost all of your elemental damage. It's essentially a different multiplier for it's a different multiplier from elemental damage, but it's the same thing. They both buff the same thing. So status enhancement will buff your frost vortex damage, will buff your unstable bomber damage, it will buff your burn damage, and your power surge damage. And if I forgot something else, I'm not sure, but pretty much burn, frost vortex, unstable bomber, and power surge. As a matter of fact, let me just check here real quick. You've got power surge, frost vortex, unstable bomber, burn. Yeah, so those are your 4 elemental and status damage bonuses. Actually, I'm a bit curious as to why people think that status damage bonus doesn't boost elemental damage guns. But anyway, that's off the topic. So yeah, either elemental overload, status enhancement, or crit boost. Now, if you don't have any of those, real quick, you can always run a crit boost. So crit rate plus 15%. You're gonna gain much less from elemental overload or status enhancement. However, as it buffs your crit rate, it'll allow you to proc the second feature more consistently. However, it's already an overkill, because pretty much with around 10%, you will already proc that second feature enough of times that you don't need to proc it so many times, since essentially you just need to proc it once every 3 seconds. Now, moving on to boots, run Covered Advance. It's like all of the other guns, it's the general best for like every single weapon. Nothing else really beats it, as they're either all more conditional or give less buffs. Now for your top mod, if you don't have perfect subs, go with either Munitions Amplifier or Flame Resonance. If you do have perfect subs, then go with Flame Resonance. Lastly, for pants, you have 2 options here. So it's either going to be Precision Charge or Bullet Siphon. The difference between those two is that if the enemy has weak spots and you can actually land your shots on the enemy's weak spots, then go with Precision Charge, as it'll be better. For a long-term damage. Though if the enemy does not have weak spots, Bullet Siphon will always come out on top. Just keep in mind that every single enemy in this game has weak spots except like 3 enemies. And also keep in mind that you will have less startup damage with precision charge, since the buff is only given after landing at least 60% of your bullets of your previous total magazine capacity into weak spots. But after that first mag, you're going to start dealing way more damage than bullets I found. So now let's go over the Cradle buffs. So mandatory or almost mandatory one, you'd want automatic weapon enhancement, and you'd want tactical combo, status enhancement, first round blast, and transient impact. Now that leaves us with 3 empty choices. So you could choose between anti-void rifle to deal 100% damage, well, increase damage to super anomaly void. Then you can also choose Deviation Master to deal more damage against Great Ones when your deviation is out. Then you can choose to pick a Master Tactician as well to increase your Great Ones damage. And then we move on to the last row. You've got Steady Hand, right? So while in Fortress Warfare or Fast Gunner status, weak spot damage plus 40%, and weak spot damage to the bullseye plus 20%. So for this one, you'll either need to use the axe or any bullseye weapon. Then Lone Walker if you're fighting solo for the 20% increased damage to monsters. And lastly, Bounty Hunter. So after defeating a unit you marked yourself with one of your bullseye guns, weapon damage plus 25% and weak spot damage plus 35%. Now let's talk about the food buffs that you want to run. So, well, starting with drink ones. The first one is going to be Whimsical Drink. Used to gain 25% status damage bonus. You will need that to gain more damage. However, if you can't craft that, you can always craft some Stardust Raspberry Shaved Ice. So used to increase your continuous debuff effect duration by 20%. So it's going to prolong your Power Surge and your Bullseye effect status. Now for the food choices. Your best option is going to be the Crumbly Bread. This is going to be your best one, used to increase all weapon damage by 25%. Now, if you can't craft that, you can always go for the weaker options. So, for instance, assorted canned fruits, so weak spot damage was 20%. Mixed fried hot dog, 20% more damage towards enemies affected by the bullseye. Bone indeed, like there's a lot of options, right? So even shellfish meat, as long just make sure that you can fulfill their buff requirement, and also that if they're useful for the content you're trying to clear. Now another side note is for your pan-fried fish, those buffs are actually stackable between each other. So for instance, you can craft yourself some angel fish, right? Well, actually no, this one gives crit damage, but let's say just weak spot damage bonus, you'll benefit from that. The one with the sea bass, you'll benefit from that as well. Fire rate plus 10%. And Barracuda as well. PSI intensity plus 5%. So these ones are actually stackable. So this concludes the food buffs. I hope you enjoyed my guide. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, as I immensely appreciate the support. Anyway, if you have questions or video suggestions, don't hesitate to drop them in the comments. And for now, take care. I'll see you in my next one. Ciao.